I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today, and we have a very special guest. I've known Tiffany Lashmet for quite a few years. How long, Tiffany? How long has it been?
Gosh, Carrie, at least 10 years.
It's been quite some time. So we're going to talk all things grazing leases today. Tiffany is an attorney who works with Texas A&M Extension out of their Amarillo office. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you do specifically for Texas A&M in that capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. I have what I like to call my dream job. I'm an attorney for Texas A&M, and so in my role, I'm an extension agricultural law specialist. What that means is I spend my time providing educational material to Texas landowners and ag producers about legal issues that affect them. So everything from water law to landowner liability, estate planning, oil and gas and energy leases, and of course, grazing leases, which we're going to talk about today.
So you have a fantastic agricultural law blog. I believe it is award-winning. Where can people follow up on your blog after today?
Yeah, well, I always try to give you props, Carrie, because you were the first person I knew that had a legal blog. And so I am merely following in your Rinker Law blog footsteps. But I blog at the Texas Agriculture Law blog. You can find that. It's agrilife.org/Texas Ag Law, or you can just Google Texas Ag Law blog and it'll pop right up.
And you have a podcast yourself. So why don't you tell our listeners about your podcast?
I do. So I started last year a podcast called Ag Law in the Field. It's been so much fun to do. You've been a guest on the show, Carrie, talking about family law and agriculture. Each episode, I interview a different person, usually an attorney, and we talk about an ag law issue. And so, like I say, we've done kind of the gamut. We've done, we had someone on talking about recent nuisance lawsuits out of North Carolina. Well, one of the recent ones has been adverse possession. We've done choosing a business entity. So we try to cover topics that are timely, but are also really practical for folks. And you can find us on iTunes or anywhere you listen to podcasts. And our website address is aglaw.libsyn, that's LIBSYN.com.
Well, you've done a fantastic job with that podcast. I'm a regular subscriber and listener. So let's take the stage here on grazing leases. What exactly is a grazing lease?
Yeah, it's a great question. And they're called different things. Sometimes they're called pasture leases, sometimes grazing leases, sometimes I've heard them called cow-calf leases. So what it is, basically, it's where a person who owns livestock, usually in Texas here, at least we deal with cattle, sheep, or goats. A person that owns livestock but maybe doesn't own land or doesn't own enough land to run them will lease that land from another person, the landowner, and the livestock owner will be the tenant, and they enter into a lease relationship.
I just want to also make sure that all the listeners here are on the same page. What exactly is a lease?
Yeah, so a lease is very simply a contract. It's a contractual arrangement between a landowner and a tenant. And it allows the tenant the right to use the landowner's property for whatever the terms are set out in the lease agreement. So for a grazing lease, generally it's going to say that the tenant has the right to possess and use the landowner's property to graze livestock.
And how prevalent are grazing lease arrangements?
Leases in general are big in agriculture, and especially for your listeners in the Midwest. I mean, you guys, land prices up there are just astronomical. And so for a lot of beginning or younger farmers and ranchers, being able to have access to land to purchase may be a real problem. And so what we see a lot of are grazing leases where folks, like I say, maybe have the capital or can get the loan from the bank to purchase livestock, but they just can't get the money, the down payment or whatever they need to own the land. leases come into play there and are very useful and used quite often.
So agriculture is notoriously a handshake culture, right?
Yes.
Handshake industry. So how often are grazing leases really put in writing? And, what are the advantages, the big advantages in actually memorializing these agreements?
For sure. They're not put in writing as often as I would like. I kind of feel like I spend my life preaching about the need to put those in writing, and it's something that I understand well because I am a farmer's daughter myself, and it took me a long time to convince my daddy that we needed to get our leases in writing. So I have some experience here on that topic. We have conducted some leasing workshops here across Texas. We've had about 500 folks come to those. And from what we can tell, it's about a third or more are not in writing, which that's a big number. When you think about especially the amount of money, the amount of capital folks have tied up in leases and livestock and the ag industry, it's crazy to think about those kind of contractual agreements not being in writing. Why should they be? Lots of reasons. First and foremost, I always like to mention, and this can differ by state, but generally it may be required by the statute of frauds. Fairly common is if you have a lease that lasts for a year or more, it actually has to be in writing to be a legally enforceable contract. And so if you need to sue for breach contract with the other party, first thing the court's going to make you prove is that you had a valid contract. And so that's one example. I also always like to mention that the exercise of writing a lease down is super helpful. Just the sitting down with a pen and a piece of paper, man, you could come up with a lot of things that you might not think about when you're just making an oral lease agreement with your friend in a pasture. And then kind of the third point I'll make is, gosh, you just never know what might happen. And at my leasing workshops, I kind of tell a story that, if you lease your property from my dad on a handshake lease, you'll probably be okay because he's been around forever. He's been a landlord and a tenant, and he's a good guy. But heaven forbid something happens to him and someone inherits the land or buys the land that maybe doesn't know what's going on, has no idea how agriculture works, doesn't know what you're talking about. That can be a major issue that a written lease could sure help to soften the blow of.
So why do you think in agriculture it's so difficult for producers to want to get those contracts in writing?
Well, I'll tell you the story that my dad told me, which is that, I think a lot of these relationships go back a long time, right? A lot of times maybe you've had a lease in place for 20, 30, 40 years. And I get I don't want them to think I don't trust them. It's a big concern, right? And I always try to tell people, listen, you don't put a lease in place because you don't trust the person. You put a lease in place because that's going to protect the relationship that you have. And sitting down and writing out a lease, it does not have to be adversarial. You can work together on it. You can sit down together. You can, work together to come up with terms that you think are fair and right for your situation. But I think that fear of, the idea they're going to think I don't trust them is a big problem.
Yeah. And, I don't understand that completely. I think I do in part, but there are third-party intervening factors that can come in, like an eminent domain situation, right?
Sure.
Or a tornado, right? There are things that can happen. How do you address those situations?
No, exactly. Well, you don't have to look much farther than right here in my own backyard in the Texas Panhandle. You guys probably saw on the news last year, we had devastating wildfires come through. We had people who lost their lives trying to save their cattle. We lost grass, we lost fences, we lost livestock. Gosh, that's the kind of situation where you need to have stuff in writing. Whose responsibility is it to rebuild those fences? What are you going to do about, the lease payment you paid for a year and now all the grass is burned up? Those are the kind of things that, man, they happen, and having a written lease can really help deal with that especially when you're in the middle of a devastating event like that.
So let's assume all the listeners have now seen the light. They're going to get their grazing leases in writing. So what exactly is sufficient for making that lease agreement in writing? Like, I get questions all the time. Can I just send emails back and forth? Can we do text messages? Is that good enough to memorialize our agreement?
It's going to differ a little bit by state. And so since I'm not licensed in, Indiana or Illinois or any other state besides Texas and New Mexico. I'll be a little bit general. The best practice is to actually have a written document. You may be able to go to court and prove your text messages or your emails, should be a contract. You don't want to spend the time or the money to do that. You'd be a lot better off to just write something up. And I tell people all the time, type it on the typewriter, print it on the computer, write it by hand. It really doesn't matter. But you want to have a written document. You want to make sure both parties sign that document. At least here in Texas, there's no requirement that it has to be notarized. And I think that's true in most states that that's not required. But sign something. And like I say, make sure when you sit down to work that out, think about your specific situation. And Carrie, we may talk about this in a minute, but I'm very leery of any, forms where you just have to fill in the blank and sign it, because every situation is different. And so it's fine to, use a form or use a checklist, but you really need to, make that fit your specific situation. So those are kind of the tips that I would offer.
Yeah. And, even just yesterday, somebody emailed me off my blog, wanted me to send me my form partnership agreement. So what are some of those caveats in using those online forms? Have you had any or heard of any horror stories?
Yeah, I mean, look, those online forms, or I know you can run down to the office supply store, and I think you can get them for $29.99. But I've seen people try to do a grazing lease on a form that was meant for a residential lease. That caused some major problems because there are a lot of types of implied covenants or issues in a residential lease that don't exist in a grazing lease. Flip side, there are a lot of issues in a grazing lease, right? Nobody in an apartment lease is going to set a stocking rate, for crying out loud. So, that's the kind of thing where you could just run into some disasters. Again, there can be big differences in state laws. And so something that works in one state just may not work in another. And I'll tell you what I always advise people is I think it's great to sit down and do a first draft yourself. Most lawyers bill you by the hour. So get a checklist, get the sample lease, draft yours up, edit on it, and then take it to a lawyer to review it. Because you probably just saved yourself some time doing some of the legwork. But I always think it's a good idea, especially, like I say, when we're dealing with, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of assets a lot of the time. You need to have an attorney's eyes on that. And the other thing I always recommend is have an attorney look over your grazing lease one time. You could probably use that lease for, a lot of years. And because the law around contracts doesn't change a whole lot. It's money well spent up front to avoid a lot of expense down the road if there's a problem.
Yeah, and from the standpoint of a practicing practitioner, it's totally fine for a client to bring in a farm lease that they've already drafted, and perhaps I'll say this is a wreck. Can you please let me redraft the whole lease? But oftentimes, I'm just looking for some red flags. And another note that I wanted to make here was that not all attorneys, I want to speak for every attorney, but attorney like myself, you could say spend no more than 1 hour reviewing this. Right? You can cap me if you want to make sure that I don't, spend 10 hours of my life going through and making sure all the commas are correct. So don't be afraid to be assertive with your attorney and cap them if need be.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about this more in a minute, I think, Carrie, but that's something that especially you could put that cap on somebody who's got a lot of experience doing that type of work. A farm girl like you can knock out a farm lease in an hour, right? Somebody at a fancy law firm in, downtown Chicago may not be able to do that in an hour because they've got to go Google what terms mean. So keep that in mind.
Right. Absolutely. So let's get down to business here with these grazing leases. What are some of the big terms that are discussed?
For sure. And I think that's a good point to bring up just real briefly is remember that when you're looking at a checklist or a sample lease or thinking about terms, think about what side you're on because, I'm going to tell you the most important term I think for a landowner is not a term that a tenant would even really want to fight for in a lease. So keep that in mind. When I talk about grazing leases, the first thing I always mention is a stocking rate. I've said that before. What that is you limit the number of animals that can be placed on the property during the term of the lease. This is a hugely important term for a landowner. Tenant doesn't care, probably doesn't even want it in there. But for a landowner, right, the concern is if I lease my land to you, Carrie, for a year, and I've seen your, social media, you bring all your goats and your cattle and your chickens, and the next thing I know, maybe all of my forage is gone. My place is now unleasable the next year when our lease expires because you've gone in and basically mined the resources. You can put a limit to that. You put a stocking rate in there and say you can only run so many head. or so many head per acre. It's set like that a lot. And that limits that kind of concern. So I think that that's a super important term. I think another term that's really important is to have something in there that limits what can be done on the property. You want to say, hey, I'm going to lease this to you for grazing cattle only. You can't bring your goats. You can't bring your horse. Your kids can't come ride their four-wheelers. Be very specific about those kind of limitations. Another issue that pops up here in Texas all the time, I assume it's probably similar in the Midwest as well, is deal with hunting season. Who has the hunting rights? We see a lot of fights here in November when deer season rolls around and you leased it to somebody to graze. You thought they were just going to graze cattle, and you thought maybe you were going to hunt or lease the hunting rights to someone else. Address that up front. And I always say, do that with a pencil in your hand, and you're a lot better off than with firearms standing across the fence. So
Good
I think
call on that.
That's another one that's really important as well.
You brought up a good point on some conflicting interests or priorities, so to speak. So do you think that both parties, both the tenant and the landlord, need to have their own attorney?
I think it probably depends on the situation. I would always leave that to the private practitioner to make their own decision. I suppose if we were taking an ethics exam in law school, I would give you one answer. In the real world, I might give you a little different one. In general, especially if you're dealing with somebody who you've not dealt with before, or maybe who you don't have a relationship with, I'd sure recommend having an attorney take a look over that. From an attorney perspective, it's a little bit difficult, I think, to look over a lease and try to advise both parties, just because they do kind of have the potential, at least, for adversarial interests.
How is duration usually brought up in these grazing leases? Is it for a season? Is it for a year? Have you seen many long-term grazing leases?
It can be set up any way you want, and it'll depend a little bit on the type of operation. Generally, for a cow-calf operation, at least here in Texas, we see year-long leases. A lot of times, those are set up as what we call a periodic tenancy, where it'll be a lease for a year. So let's say January 1st to December 31st, but then it will automatically renew every year unless one party gives notice of their intent to cancel it. That's pretty common. Sometimes with stocker calves or something like that here, you might see kind of a season lease or just short as a few months. So it really just kind of depends on the type. But I would say kind of the year-to-year lease is more common.
Do you recommend security deposits for these leases?
Good question. I don't see that as often in a grazing lease. I recommend that a lot in a hunting lease. And what I tell folks always is that's something, if you're leasing to your neighbor and you guys have been friends forever, you go to church together, you sit together at the ball game on Friday night, you probably don't need a security deposit. You lease to somebody who you've never met before, you don't know anything about, I'm probably going to be asking for a security deposit. So again, depends a little bit on the facts, but I'd sure think through that when you're in that scenario.
So you already noted the hunting lease situation, but are there any other access to land issues that should be addressed in these grazing leases?
Yeah, the hunting lease is probably the most serious one. The other thing is if you've got any energy type leases on the property. For example, it's very common here in Texas to have an oil and gas lease on the same property that you might have a grazing or a hunting lease. Similarly, we've got a lot of wind production here in Texas. I know you guys have some of that in Illinois. So if I've got a wind energy tenant, that could be an issue. What I always say from the landowner's standpoint, and I don't think that there's actually a law that would necessarily require this, but I think it's just a good practice and common sense to make sure the tenants all know about each other. What the last thing you want is your grazing tenant to run off the hunter that just paid you, thousands of dollars to come hunt deer. Similarly, you don't want him running off the guy who put in the wind turbines and he's got to get there and check something. So I think it's a great idea just to have a clause in the lease that informs them of any other surface users, who they are, and just let them know that they exist.
That's a great point. I never really even thought about that, Tiffany. So let's talk about gates and fences. How are these issues addressed in grazing leases?
Hopefully they are. A lot of times the problem we see is they're not addressed at all, and that's problematic. On gates, the big issue with gates, a lot of times I see leases that will say, if you go through a gate, close the gate. You don't want to say that, particularly if you have somebody who doesn't know much about livestock. What you want to say is leave the gate the way you found it. Because we've seen some situations, and usually, again, this is hunting leases, not so much grazing leases, but hunters came in, they really followed that to the law. They shut all the gates and they closed cattle off of water. And that was a problem because they didn't know. It said to close the gates, so they did. So I think that's one issue to keep in mind. With regard to fences, it's hugely important in a grazing lease to address who's going to be responsible for maintenance and repair of fences during the lease term. There's not a lot of common law on that, at least here in Texas, and I don't really think anywhere, as far as who's responsible. Like I said, we had those wildfires come through. Wildfires come through, burns all the fences down. Who's responsible to put those back? We've seen folks that are really kind of in legal battles trying to figure that out because the landowner says that's not my duty. The tenant says, yeah, it is. I leased it with fences. Now it doesn't have them. You don't want to be in that kind of fight. And had they just addressed that up front, who's going to do that? We also see issues with water pumps, windmills, those sorts of things. Address it up front. And you can do it however you want. Real common here in the Panhandle and in eastern New Mexico, where I'm from, is we'll say that the tenant will pay for the labor, the landowner pays for the materials. I think that makes some sense. You could do it however you want. Just address it up front, because almost always some issue like that's going to come up during the lease.
Yeah, Tiffany, I have to be honest with you. 6 months ago, I had this issue come up in a farm lease dispute between a landlord and a tenant, and they're actually family, and they were fighting over fence costs and things like that. So, the devil's in the details, and oftentimes those details are overlooked.
It is. And, you think to yourself like, oh, it's just a fence. But one of our economists here in Amarillo did some studying and said, at least here we have barbed wire fences, and the estimate was $10,000 a mile to replace a fence. That's a lot of money. And now it's not just a detail in a contract, right?
Yeah, no, gates and fences especially are more expensive than what people anticipate, for sure. So let's talk about repair of facilities. I always feel like there's a little bit of a fine line with this. And how do you recommend, or how have you seen them, these clauses in grazing leases?
Yeah, repair of facilities is interesting. And I think the most important thing here is to understand the law around that and how it works. So if a tenant comes in and spends a bunch of his own money, and maybe builds a barn or does substantial repairs to a barn, hey, guess what? When the tenant leaves, the barn doesn't leave. And so you want to be careful from both sides, right? If you're a tenant, you may not want to spend all your money on something like that you're going to eventually walk away from. As a landowner, you may want some say on where or how a tenant's going to do, new buildings or repairs of facilities. And so I think that's something, again, you just need to really address up front in the lease and say, what kind of say do both parties have? How are we going to share in expenses? What types of issues might come up? Really think about your operation and think about where this might be an issue.
What are your thoughts on confidentiality clauses in these grazing leases? Perhaps either the landlord or the tenant wants to keep the terms of the agreement hush-hush.
I'll be honest with you, Carrie, from a practical perspective, I don't see that super often. I don't get many questions about that. Kind of the only place where I've seen people balk at that a little bit is if somebody wanted to go record a lease in the deed records. And there are some reasons for doing that, certainly not required, but from a tenant perspective, that might be good to put folks on notice that the lease exists. Sometimes a landowner may not want his lease in the public record. You could see things like how much he charges, what stocking rates are, et cetera. And so in that situation, I've seen it pop up. That can be handled by filing a memorandum of lease that doesn't contain those details. But generally, I don't see it one party to another. If there were a reason for it and a concern that someone had, I'd sure talk through that and think about it. Where I have seen it is in livestock leases, as you're familiar with, seed stock. We lease rams at our place. We are sheep and cattle people. And I could see maybe a reason for that in that situation. So like I say, I don't think it's something that would be a deal breaker for me. I think I might want to understand why the person had that concern and see if I thought it really was a big deal to me.
What are your thoughts on dispute resolution clauses in these agreements?
I'm pretty sure, Carrie, you and I are on the same page with this. I'm a big believer in dispute resolution. I worked all through college at a mediation office, and I just know the benefit that mediation and arbitration can do. And so I tell folks all the time, I'd sure consider putting in a dispute resolution clause in your lease. Going to court's expensive. It takes forever. If you can settle this dispute out of court, it's almost always going to be better for everybody. The one warning I like to give people is make sure that you understand the difference between types of dispute resolution and understand what you're agreeing to. Arbitration and mediation are kind of the two main types. They're very different. There are benefits to both. There are reasons to do each of those. But make sure that you know what you're agreeing to if you include that in a contract. And that's another example, right, of where that form lease could maybe bite you if you don't pay attention to what you're doing.
I wanted to also note that some people are concerned about, well, what if there's an emergency? I need to be able to get to the courthouse. And we could draft it where if there's an emergency, you can go to the courthouse and just have that exception be available to people.
Absolutely.
So in terms of grazing leases, are there many differences in negotiating or drafting leases with different livestock species, like with cattle versus sheep and goats, etc.?
It's funny, when I saw that you were going to ask this question, I called my dad because, he's my go-to for anything real life. And then I talked to a couple other ranchers. I know we can't really come up with anything. So what I think I would say is, I think if you have a pretty good template for any sort of livestock lease, you can probably adapt that template to anything else. For example, your stocking rate obviously is going to be vastly different if we're talking cattle versus sheep or goats. Maybe you have a clause in there that requires the animals to be vaccinated. A lot of times in Texas, we'll require vaccination for cattle for brucellosis. That clearly wouldn't be an issue for sheep or goats, but maybe there's another disease that you want to deal with. Maybe they have to have their scrapie tags or whatever it is. So I think really the template's about the same, although the details would certainly be different for the different livestock species.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've yet to draft a goat grazing lease, Tiffany. So I'm looking forward to the day. As you know, I'm a goat farmer now. So
I was going to say you're one of them now, Carrie. So that has to be coming.
So let's talk about fee structures that you've seen in grazing leases. What are sort of the options? What's the most popular?
I hate to keep saying this. I'm a lawyer, you can tell, because I just keep answering everything with it depends. But it's going to depend on your attorney. Generally, what I see attorneys do, and Carrie, you can sure speak to what you do, is either an hourly rate on a grazing lease or a flat fee. So maybe they'll say that the lease is going to cost X amount. And it doesn't matter how much time I spend on it, that's what you pay. Or they'll charge you by the hour. And hopefully if they're going to bill you by the hour, they can ballpark for you, especially in something like drafting a lease. That's pretty straightforward. They can probably ballpark for you how long that will take. We get into litigation, for example, and if you're going to be taking a case to trial, it's next to impossible to know how many hours that's going to take. But drafting a lease should be. So generally, that's what you'll see. Those are the two types of agreements. I would just say make sure up front you understand exactly what type of fee structure you have. If it's hourly, what's the hourly rate? If it's a set rate, what is that rate? And just make sure you're very comfortable with the attorney and that you understand what the plan is.
So what do you tell folks who are afraid of entering in a written grazing lease because they're like, what if I want to get out of this? What if their relationship goes sour or there's a dispute? How do I get out of this?
I actually think that entering into a written grazing lease is the way you do that. If you're in a situation and you have an oral grazing lease, you're still going to have problems getting out of that. And frankly, maybe more problems because you're not going to have kind of an escape hatch clause written into that oral lease because you don't have a lease at all. And then you're going to be, in a situation with kind of a he said, she said fight going on in front of a judge. That can't be a better alternative. You write up a grazing lease and in there you need to, think about if things go south, if a drought occurs or wildfire occurs, or if we have some sort of dispute amongst ourselves, how can we write this to where we can get out of the lease fairly? And this is something I should have mentioned earlier when we were talking about the important terms. From a tenant perspective, one of the most important terms is going to be the length of time notice-wise they are given if that lease is going to terminate. Because a tenant's going to have to find somewhere else to put those animals, and that may not be as easy to do as just making a phone call, right? So, when we're thinking about getting out of a lease, et cetera, having a term in there that really, defines that and gives the notice requirements and the length of time a tenant has to get off the property, really important.
So you help co-author an outstanding resource on agriculture leases that discuss, among other things, grazing leases. Why don't you tell everybody about that handbook and where they can view it?
Yeah, for sure. So we wrote this handbook. I co-authored it with some of my friends that are attorneys. We used some of Carrie's materials to help us do that. And it's called the Rancher's Agricultural Leasing Handbook. And I'll tell you how this came about. There are a lot of great resources out there for farm leases. I don't know if you've ever kind of Googled. There's a lot of great information for row crop leases, right? Corn, soybeans, that kind of thing. There wasn't much out there for grazing leases or hunting leases. And so we thought, let's write a handbook for kind of those ranching landowners versus farm landowners that's got some practical information. And so we talk through everything from why leases should be in writing to how to set payment rates, things like landowner liability. And then we've got checklists and some sample language so you kind of see how you would write that clause as well. You can find that on my website. If you just go to the Texas Agriculture Law blog, I've got a little tab there called Published Materials. You'll see that handbook on there.
And it's just outstanding. So Tiffany, we've got listeners from coast to coast. How can people find an agricultural lawyer near them?
I think that's a great question, Carrie, and one that I kind of wish there was a little bit better of an answer to. I get calls all the time. A lot of times people from out of state who maybe need an attorney here in Texas, and they say, where's a list of ag lawyers? We don't really have one, with our bar, and I wish that we did. There are a couple of things you can do. The American Agricultural Law Association, we fairly recently revamped our website. I'm a member of that group. And we have a Find a Lawyer on there, and you can go look on a map and see who's a part of the AALA. Carrie's a member and has been for a long time. In fact, that's how we met. And so that's one place to look. Another place to look, and I honestly think this is the best way to find any lawyer, is word of mouth. Ask your friends, ask other farmers or landowners in the area, who have you used? Who are you familiar with? And then the other thing, just see, it's kind of a small community, see who puts themselves out as an ag lawyer. Heck, Google it or go on Twitter or whatever and just see who might pop up. Obviously, check them out. You can always ask an attorney for, references, or you can see publications that they've written or talk to former clients. I think that's a great idea. But those are some ways to find an ag lawyer.
And what are some tips for listeners when they're interviewing lawyers, trying to make that decision? What are some questions that they should ask?
I think the most important thing actually in a question, as much as kind of a feeling, you need to have a feeling that you can really communicate with this lawyer. You need to feel like you can tell them what you need to tell them, that they're going to shoot straight with you, that you can understand each other in those conversations. I think that's so important. From a lease perspective or any sort of agricultural issue, I always think it's really good to find a lawyer that has at least some ag background. You don't have to necessarily be a goat farmer and raise animals like Carrie does, but if you've got somebody who at least is familiar with the concept of a stocking rate, right, or understands the type of clauses that need to be in there about fences or cattle getting out on the highway or those sort of things, just some background in that can be hugely helpful. Not required, but I think it could save some time and maybe spot some issues that somebody else might miss. And so I think those are kind of the key things I would point people to.
Yeah, all great points, Tiffany. So once again, how can people find you? How can they find your blog and your podcast?
Yeah, for sure. So probably the best place to go is my website. You can just Google Texas Agriculture Law blog, or you can go to it's agrilife.org/Texas Ag Law. The podcast is called Ag Law in the Field, and you can find that wherever you listen to your podcasts, or you can go to aglaw.libsyn, LIBSYN.com. I've got a Texas Agriculture Law page on Facebook, and you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @Tiff, TIFF, Dowell, DOWELL.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise, Tiffany.
Absolutely, Carrie. I'm glad to do it.
All right, we've now entered into the Ask Carrie portion of the podcast. The next question comes from somebody in Illinois. He writes, what are some issues to consider in my bull lease? So I think that this is actually a big enough topic where we can have an entire podcast based on this. So I'm just going to scratch the surface. But my number one piece of advice that I have for cattle producers, that if there is a bull that's going to be leased, please try to get something in writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be drafted by an attorney. It could be just that you've memorialized your agreement in an informal document. But I do certainly recommend to get it in writing and don't just trust in that handshake deal. So first and foremost, I really suggest that my cattle producers, I identify the bull specifically. Is it a registered Angus bull or a Simmental bull? You want to put the registration numbers, put the tattoo numbers, properly identify exactly what bull or bulls are going to be leased. Number two, which cows are these bulls going to be bred to? I would be as specific as you can here and go ahead and memorialize the list of cows that the bulls will be exposed to during the term of the lease. Where is the bull going to be used? And especially in this day and age, we have farmers that have multiple parcels of land. Perhaps their mailing address is going to be a different address on where the bull is going to actually be utilized. So please go ahead and identify that in the bull lease. Delivery is another big issue. Is the cow owner going to go pick up the bull, or is the bull owner going to deliver the bull? And who bears the burden of risk that risk of loss during the delivery stage? What's the term of the lease? Is it just going to be for a short period of time? Did you use any kind of extra synchronization? Or is this going to be for a few months to be utilized as a cleanup bull? What are the payment terms? Are there any kind of provisions in there for late payment, interest rate, etc.? Here are a few other terms to consider, such as an option to purchase. This is something that some cattle owners really like to have properly memorialized. Is there any kind of insurance requirement? Are there any kind of representations? Like, for example, oftentimes people will say that I represent that the bull has perhaps a particular gene marker or has a scrotal circumference of X, Y, and Z. So if there's any representations that are made on either the bulls or the cows, they should be made there in the lease itself. Are there any record keeping requirements for the cow owner? What if the bull gets sick? Who's going to be paying for the veterinary care for that bull? Any kind of specifications on the care of the bull. Is the bull supposed to be fed a certain regiment, or is the bull going to just be out on grass during the time period of the lease? We already briefly touched on the risk of loss or injury or illness. Some other thoughts to consider would be if there's any warranty or guarantee. For example, a few years ago, I had an Angus producer contact me, and the bulls that was leased, the semen, they were having difficulties with the quality of the semen. So are there any guarantees there with the bull itself? Are you going to guarantee some soundness and semen quality? What if either side wants to get out? So termination is certainly a big issue. Finally, we only got two more big topics to mention are confidentiality. For some cattle producers, they want to keep the terms of the bull lease confidential because they want, especially with the payment terms, perhaps, they want to be able to go to another cattle producer and negotiate the payment terms separately. And dispute resolution, I think this is oftentimes overlooked. And people end up in court sometimes in states that they didn't intend to get into. For example, if the bull owner is in Ohio and the cow owner is in Illinois, then if there is a dispute, which state are you going to go to? So there are some of the big terms. If you have a question that you would like for me to address in this podcast, please be sure to email me at Carrie@rincardlaw.com, spelled CARI. at RINCKERLAW.com. Again, that's Carrie@rincardlaw.com. Please go ahead and shoot me an email with your question that you want addressed.